Hey friends, welcome back. Gabriel Kevin here. How are you today? Hope you're doing great. Hope everything's going well with your music and mixing and everything. So, this is another installment in my music tutorials, suite of tutorials for mixing, mastering, producing, and all that stuff. And today, we're going to talk about mixing. Mixing. Okay, so sometimes that can be easy, sometimes that can be very challenging. So let's just go through it, and I'm going to pass on my ideas. I'm not going to do any type of visual with Studio One or any DAW because I think mixing transcends the DAWs. And DAWs, if you don't know that, that's Digital Audio Workstation. And that's like Studio One or Pro Tools and whatever you have. That's great. But mixing, I think, is more of an art using a technology. So you use technique, but it's an art. Uh, the analogy I would use would be a painter. And I've taken art classes and painting classes and stuff like that, and learned a lot of this from those art teachers and other folks that are in the fine arts world. So picture a painting that's done, the final product. It's beautiful, like Starry Night, Van Gogh. Now picture an empty canvas. So somehow we went from the empty canvas to that final product of the painting. Has all kinds of colors in it. If we're talking about an oil painting with a color one, not charcoal, and it's beautiful. And how did the artist go from that blank canvas to that final product? That's the same thing as mixing. So in the art world, they always say to go from light to dark. That means start out light with the colors, and then just start making it darker and darker and add more and add more and add more. Now, the thing about when you do that from an art point of view, if you add too much in one spot, it usually looks like mud. So all the colors get blended together and it starts getting icky, and it's pretty hard to get out of that. And sometimes you might have to start over. So that is a really good analogy to me in terms of how to mix. So you wrote a song, you bought a DAW, you bought your equipment, you've recorded everything, and now you're ready to mix it. So to me, there's two ways to actually do that process, I would say. One would be mix as you go. So if you lay down, say, drum tracks and then a bass, you could, at that point, do a quick mix of those two together. And say you put down a rhythm guitar or a hard metal guitar, and then mix that in there. Now, it's not basically your final mix, but you're mixing as you're going. So as you add more instruments in your recording, you'll be able to hear where it might fit, and you might want to be able to, well, I didn't like that recording because it doesn't fit into the mix yet, or as nicely as I wanted to. The other technique would be to record everything because you kind of know what you want to do, and then start mixing. Now, that one could cause you to get a little bit too deep into things and trying to, hey, I got to put this in, I got to put that in, I got to do this, I got to do that. And all of a sudden you might end up with mud. You just don't want to have mud. And if you ever have done a lot of mixing, I'll be honest, I've created mud. Beautiful, wonderful mud. So even if you record everything and then mix, I think you're still going to start with somewhere, and usually it's a rhythm track. I would say it's either a rhythm track, mix, or a vocal mix. Now, myself, I would tend to record pretty much everything, a little bit of mix just so I can hear it when I'm recording the next thing. But then I would actually start with the vocals. That's me. The other way I think would be a good way to start mixing is at the rhythm track. So the drums, the bass, the rhythm guitar, or whatever you have that's making the rhythm of your song, a beat or whatever. So it's up to you, but in the end, you still have to build it. And you don't want to try to mix everything at once, in my humble opinion. So you have to pick somewhere you're going to start to mix. And mixing can get very complicated. It could be very simple. If you only have an acoustic guitar and you have a vocal and maybe a harmony and maybe a tambourine, that should be fairly easy to mix. And I remember years ago somebody said to me when we were in a studio, and this goes still to the recording, goes to production, but it ends up in your time when you're mixing, is that the fewer tracks you have, the fewer instruments, or the fewer amount of things to mix, the bigger those things are going to sound. And that makes sense, right? Because there's nothing else interfering with it or have to compete with it. And that's where you start getting into a lot of the muddy things that occur, is when you have a lot of competition, especially in the same frequency range. So if you have a mid-range guitar and a mid-range keyboard and a mid-range anything else, that's all in the same frequency range. You're going to get a frequency competition, and you're going to be fighting each one, trying to, well, I'm going to pull out the guitar. Well, it's pushing the other thing back, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to push that one back. And now, not, you're avoiding mud, but at the same time, you're sitting there trying to figure out, how do I get this to sound right? Sound right to your own ears. And I would highly recommend that you mix the way you want to mix, what you like. You can have other people hear it, but just make sure that you are the one who's satisfied with it. So let's go into one thing that I think that really helps me out. I look at mixing in terms almost of like a 3D picture. So there's three elements to me that I always keep in mind when I'm mixing. And I have it in product in mind. So you have to have some in product in mind, right? You have to have like, I hear the final version somewhere out there in space. The final frontier. Here we go. Okay. So what are those three things? The first thing to me is volume. And I have a volume management tutorial that you might want to look at. And volume to me, obviously, if like you have something in the same frequency range, if you raise the volume of one of them, it's going to push the other one back because they're in the same frequency range. The other thing, the second thing, would be the stereo spectrum, left to right, or right to left, center, all that stuff. That's another way to separate things. And the last one would be frequency. So you have volume, stereo spectrum, and frequency. Those three things will, if you keep them in mind, will help you in your mixing. So why, Gabriel? Why would that be? Because if you have things that are competing in frequency and you want to resolve it, one way is volume, we talked about, but then it hurts the other one. Whatever the other two things are in your frequency competition. So you can separate them. And this might seem obvious, but if you keep this in mind, as you mix, you'll think, wow, okay, those two things, they're just fighting each other there, and then it's hurting the vocal. I have too much stuff there, and the mid-range of that stuff is hurting the mid-range of the vocal. Use that stereo spectrum. Just use it. Even if you have to do it dramatically, at least initially. Push things to the left, push things to the right that are in the same frequency, and see where your ear hears them to be. And you might like, okay, that rhythm guitar I pushed over to the right and I moved those strings to the left, and wow, it just opened up the whole middle. There's something called a vocal pocket. And this, I learned from some really great folks way back when in mixing and mastering, is always, if you have vocals in your song, always remember you need a vocal pocket. You need something where the vocal has a pocket in the mix around it that it can exist. And that's why I usually start with vocals, because I don't even create the pocket. I start with the vocals, and then I build around the vocals. And some things I might have centered with the vocals, like a bass or a kick drum, because there's no frequency competition between a bass, a kick drum, and a vocal, generally, unless you're really singing low. Other things I'll start putting into the stereo spectrum. And, it's very pleasing, I think, to people's ears when they hear things to the left and to the right and here and there. And when I first started mixing, I thought, I don't want that to go to the left, because nobody's going to hear it. It's going to be over there. And so not true. So not true. Actually, they hear it more because you separated it. So use that stereo spectrum wisely. Use it and experiment with it. Now, the other thing is the frequency. So stereo to me goes this way. Frequency to me goes vertical to bottom, like low end to high end, and volume kind of goes forward and backwards. So there's that 3D picture I think you need to put into your head as you go through this journey of mixing. So as you're building it, and if you're building it from the bottom up, which would be from the rhythm up, and from, say, the lower end to the higher end, that way you'll be able to judge your frequency and where things are falling, and you'll see well, you'll hear frequency competition pretty much right away. And then you know, okay, I got things separated in frequency, and you can use EQ. Let's take a step back for frequency. You can use EQ to separate. So it's obvious to separate by stereo spectrum, because you go left, right, and just pan. And I have a tutorial on panning too. He has a tutorial on everything. What? But if you have frequency competition and you don't want to pan, then use your EQ. You can use static EQ or dynamic EQ. Generally, you would use static EQ, where you EQ it and it's fixed. The EQ stays. Dynamic EQ usually is when it hits a certain threshold of a volume, the EQ kicks in. Look at my mastering tutorial. I explain it in there. So if you have some frequency competition, say a rhythm guitar and a keyboard, it's kind of like in the middle somewhere, and say the keyboard is strings. Maybe it's cellos and high-end strings and something like that. And then the rhythm guitar is, a basic, maybe Les Paul going through a nice, vintage amp or something, and you're getting a nice, range and a nice tonal quality. But they're competing. But you don't want to separate them. Or you only want to separate them a little bit. You just don't want to separate them all the way to the end, left and right. Try EQ. Take one of them and take the bottom out of it. Take the other one and pull down the high end. And play with both. Solo them. Solo them together, and then play with the EQ of each one and see how, no, I'll do it the other way. And you can do it very slowly. And as you change the EQ of those competing frequency instruments, you will find, and I have done this a lot, I'll find that happy medium where, okay, I only have to separate them a little bit to get the vocal pocket, and now they're fine because instead of being at this frequency, they've gone to this kind of frequency position in the mix. So frequency can be used to separate by using EQ. Then you could also more stereo separate. And the other thing you can do is volume. So if you have something, I've done this. I had something on the left and something on the right, and I had another thing on the left because I wanted it there. So now these two on the left, if they're on top of each other and in the same frequency, and if they're not in the same frequency sometimes, I will use volume to pull out the one that I want to be more heard and let the other one be more in the background. Like a lot of times I'll use strings and I'll put them in the background. And sometimes I'll make it, a stereo record and the strings are across the whole thing, and I just pull that back and let everything else come in front of it. But it's still there. And I know it's good or not good when I mute it. So I'm hearing it, and it's like, it's back there, and I'm like, I know it's there, I know it's there, I know it's there, but I chose to use volume as a separation, so I pulled it back. And then I'll test it. I'll hit the mute button. Oh, wow, what a difference. Put it back on. Now, it's so crazy, it really is, that the end product that you have, even before mastering, of your final mix, is, if you really, really put your heart into it and really listen and be true to yourself and look at the reality of what you're hearing, and sometimes step away from it and come back, and you have that final mix. And I've done this. I have a final mix, and listen to my 5 songs out there. There's stuff going on that you may not hear it, but it's there because it needs to be there in the mix. So you have your prominent things and you have your things in the background. That's your volume. You have your highs and lows that go through the frequency. There's separation there, and you can use EQ. And then left and right is the most obvious one that you separate, but you don't want to just put everything to the left and everything to the right and nothing in the middle. So I tend to use that stereo spectrum and place things in that spectrum where I feel like it, and then I'll do an initial mix, put the vocals in there. I'll have my rhythm track. So I do vocals, rhythm track, and then I build around that. Because the vocals and the rhythm track tend never to compete. Ah, and everything else can start competing. Then you have your high-end cymbals, and you can have a tambourine. They could be competing, but just build it. Now, some things, some little tricks and tips that will really save you from that mud area. There's a mud area somewhere around 200, 300, 400 in the EQ range that almost seems like everything in the world hits that frequency area. Not down where 35 where you're hearing the of the kick, and not all the way up, like 16K where it's the sizzle of the cymbals. But and then there's that 1K area where 1K and below you start getting that mud area. Because it just seems like somehow sound waves and everything from instruments all those instruments and everything, even vocals, hit that area. So what do? Well, in the end, in the mastering, and if you look at my mastering video, a tutorial, I show how I initially work my first EQ, and it's usually I'm dipping out of that area, crossing over around 1K and coming up, bringing up some of the nice pretty stuff in the vocals after 1K, and then depending how sizzly things are, I'll either go up or I'll go down at the end. And then at the bottom, very bottom, I am trailing off with a shelf. So I'm usually trailing off with a shelf at the bottom and then either coming up or down at the very high end, and it's usually like a sine wave curve. But that's after the fact. So you don't want to have to rely on that while you're mixing. So that mud area, one little trick that I do is, say, vocals. So vocals, you have an EQ that goes like this, depending on the vocal. It's a low vocal, high vocal, soprano. And no matter what it is, after about 300, I'm trailing it off. I'm just dipping down. All that stuff to me in a vocal below 300, 400, and you have to find it based on the vocal you have. Use a shelf, a low-end shelf, and just drop. That's all just, to me, and you can put in the comments what you think. To me, that's just noise. When you're singing, there's all ambient noise going on, and you have a really nice microphone. It's picking up everything, and look at my recording in terms of how you do sound reinforcement on that, but still you're going to pick up some kind of bottom end in that microphone. That's just the nature of sound. Kill it. Kill that bottom end of the vocals. Okay. For things like a bass and stuff like that, I would kill bottom end way down, 35 or something, unless you want to have really, you're intending that this is going to sound so great in these huge subwoofers. It'll still sound great in them. And tail off some of the way low bottom end on that. Keyboards, I tend to, depending if it's strings or something, not necessarily piano, we'll get to that, but it's strings, even if it's cellos, I'll do the same thing. I'll tail off somewhere along the bottom end, and you got to listen to it. I can't give an exact frequency range where you're going to tail off bottom end in that 200, 300, 400 area, but high-end strings, there's nothing in that area that you want. So get rid of it and tail it off, but you have to do it by ear, not by visual. And once you start doing that, and just tail off things here and there in that area, you're going to hear your mix come out. All these other things are come out because that stuff is sitting there pressing down on your whole mix. Get it out of there. Just get it out of there. And then you can also, with vocals, remember, and I'm just throwing things out here and hopefully writing it down or re-listen to this. Sometimes, a lot of times with vocals, I saw some tutorials in this and I'm like, yes, okay, remember this. That in vocals, it's breath. And sometimes you think your vocals sound flat, not flat in terms of key or note, but flat in terms of like, it's just dull. My vocals are dull. I put tons of reverb on it and they're still dull. There's a thing called air in vocals and air in final mix. So I tend to have my vocals, I trail off the bottom somewhere where, depending on the type of vocal it is, And then I'll come and I usually raise a little bit, around the 10, okay? And depending on it, and it's all by ear, getting past 12K and above, I might have a slight slope, like a high shelf, that just, and it depends on the vocal, and I have to play with it. Because once I hear the final mix, I'm always keying on the vocal, making sure that the vocal is being heard, and it's being heard extremely well. And then I'll just bring up that tail end, high end, a little bit up, and you'd be surprised how it adds air to the vocal. And now the vocal sounds like not normal, like more natural. Because remember, there's all this stuff going on if you have a lot of instruments you're mixing. So you want that air, and that air can actually, and this is an EQ thing, right? And it's like an EQ separation. That air actually is allowing the vocals to come out even more, and you didn't even raise the volume. Well, actually, raising EQ, in essence, kind of raises volume in that frequency, but you're not raising the fader volume. And that, a lot of times, I'll be like, whoa, here are the vocals. I am so happy with that. And I saw that, I didn't make that up. I saw that in other tutorials, and I kind of knew it, but when I watched the tutorials, I'm like, yeah. So I tend to do that a lot. So I'll tail off the bottom. I'll bring up some of the high mids, and then based on my ear, I'll add air to where I want to add it. So hopefully that helps in terms of the three-dimensional view in your mind of left, right, forward, back is volume, and up, down is frequency, and you can use every one of them to cause separation or add accentuation or pull things back to add a fill. That's very nice. Or if you're adding things that we're going to talk about, and if you look at my producing tutorial, ear candy. So after you do a lot of mixing and you put things together, and you added ear candy, or maybe at that point you're going, oh, I need something here, and then look at my producing tutorial, like with yellow butterfly and the flute and stuff like that. And you add something here and you add something there. If you had really taken your time and did a really nice mix and really separated your EQs out and put the EQs correctly, strings, they need EQ there. The bass needs EQ there. And there's no rule here. It's subjective. Music is subjective. You may like your bass punchy. I may like my bass deep. Doesn't matter. Just make it where it is, what you want. If you want it punchy, then you need to add more high end to it. If you want it not punchy, then don't. And a real quick thing on bass. Try this. Adding some high end to a bass will bring out that bass. Even though the listener may not hear that high end, but the high end of the bass will cut through, and you don't always want to get rid of frequency competition. Sometimes you want to join frequencies so that they blend, and the high end of the bass blends with the low end of the rhythm guitar, and the low end of the bass blends with the kick drum. And then that's just basic stuff, but that's, you can do it any way you want. But anyway, getting back to ear candy, so if you really had separated things or blended them the way you wanted to in your mix, and now you're adding ear candy after the fact, which I tend to do. I tend to add ear candy after the fact, like that flute. It'll fit somewhere because you have such a mosaic mix that you don't have any mud. You have things just perfectly where you want them. And it takes time to mix. Don't think you're going to do it overnight. And then that ear candy, whatever, strings or this or another vocal in the background to the left, to the right, whatever, will just place wherever you want to. And it was easy to place that flute. It was simple. Everything was so well put together that I just placed it there. And I'm like, okay, a little bit to the left. And then, oh, there it is. I EQ'd it. Listen to the EQ of the mix. And then EQ'd the flute to get it and make sure it's coming out. So, the more high-endy something is, the more it's going to come out, right? I mean, you don't want everything shrilling. So hopefully that helps in terms of the concept and idea and tips and tricks and just basic mixing. And, you learn as you go. And then you let other people hear it. And they go, well, I can't really hear the vocals. Well, if you think you can hear the vocals and everybody else says they can't hear the vocals, then I think you might have a problem with the vocals because they're the people that are going to buy it. But if that's the way you want it, that's fine. I mean, I've said this before, like the Beatles, they would put the vocals all the way to the right and the drums all the way to the left. Well, you're going to hear the vocals because they're eating up the whole left side of the spectrum. You can do that, and you can do whatever you want. It's subjective. Just do whatever you want, whatever makes you feel good. But hopefully some of these ideas and working it, taking your time, and really listening will help you. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in mixing, and please listen to my songs, and you know, I did a lot of work on the mixes of those. And then, by the way, once you're done your mixing, then you go to mastering, and that's where you put the final touches of EQ and the final touches of pushing the overall volume and all that, and just makes it boom. That's a cool way of talking about mastering. Boom. So look at the mastering tutorial. I'm not going to do a mastering thing here. It's in that, and please do mastering. So for mixing and for mastering, both, when you mix, you need to have good references. I said before, when you record, you need a really, really good microphone. You look at most tutorials are going to say, if you're going to spend money on a really good vocal mic. I can make most any amplifier sound good in a mix. But vocals, it's a human. Vocal cords, it's the most expressive part, I believe, other than maybe guitar solos or whatever, keyboard solos, in a mix. So you need good references. So if you look at my studio equipment video, so what I have, I'm kind of a freak with monitors. So in front of me, I'm looking at my screen and looking at you. How you doing? Hope all is well. And I have 3 pair of 5-inch speakers, Yamahas, Neumann, and Adams. And they're bing, bing, bing. And I have the ability to switch while I'm mixing, just switch bing, those speakers, bing, those speakers, bing, those speakers. And of course you have to position yourself in that triangle of your speakers, because you moving forward and backwards with monitors, it's going to change what you hear. It's going to change the frequency that's going to go into your ears. So it's generally the distance between, say, the woofers should be the same distance this way to you when you're listening. And I put tape on the floor, and I'll roll my chair back. Okay, I'm going to hear the Adams here, and I'm going to hear the Yamahas here, just to make sure that I'm hearing them correctly. And I'll mix generally to the Neumanns, because I think they have the best. I think they're KH120s, and they really have a great frequency response. It's pretty flat. And what does that mean, flat, if you don't know what that means? Flat means that it's not colored, it's not enhanced. So when you buy maybe Bose speakers for your home stereo or your car stereo speakers and the actual stereo, they're enhanced. They provide really good bass, really good high end and everything. And you can change your bass and everything on those things, but those speakers tend to have a lot more enhancement to the sound, just the fact of the speakers, because that's the market and that's what everybody likes and that's what I like. But when you mix flat, not flat notes. You find monitors that produce a flat sound, and sometimes it could bother you because you're like, but you got to get used to it. The flat sound would be the high end, the high mids, the low mids, the lows, the bottom sub, all tend to be linear in that speaker. That way you can actually judge where things are going to fall in an equal way. So how do you know how it's going to sound when you put in your stereo or in your car? Because that's how you do mixdown. So in Studio One, you would go to Song at the top, and you would do Export Mixdown, and you mix down to an MP3 file. I would recommend 44.1 resolution, and put it on your smartphone. Create a CD, burn a CD, and put it onto your stereo, or just Wi-Fi, whatever, and then listen to that linear mix that you did, the flat mix, and then listen to it in the enhanced speakers. You'd be so surprised, because all that great stuff comes out the way you really, in the end, want to hear it. But if you have colored speakers, when I say colored, that means the speakers are enhancing the sound themselves, and you mix to that, then you may find when you go to your normal speakers, there's no bass. I'm using an example. There's no bass. Why? Because you use monitor speakers that enhance the bass, and you weren't enhancing the bass. The speaker enhances the bass more than a flat sound, so you left the bass where it was. But then when you go, the bass is too low. So get flat linear speakers, and most of them, most like the Yamahas, the Neumanns, the Adams, the Focals, they are almost all flat, but you have to use your ear. I like to have a lot of monitors because for mixing and mastering, I like to hear the difference because in the world, and this is where references come into play, especially in mastering. But if you do really good mixing and you really take your time and you really have good monitors and you really listen, your mastering is going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier. You don't want to be fighting and mastering because you didn't do something correct in the mix. So I'll listen to them because I know in the world that there's all kinds of speakers. There's headphones. There's the earbuds. There are car stereos. There are stereos. There is all kinds of stuff. It's different kinds of speakers. Everything. So it's really computer speakers. People work and they play it on their computer speaker. It has to sound as best as you can in all those areas. So that's why I have so many monitors, because every one sounds a little bit different. And then over here, I'm pointing, I have my 8-inch, really nice big focal that I got, focal monitors, and those are my go-to. So I'll start mixing with the 5-inch, and then then I'm pretty good with it because, it really just gives me a good linear flat sound. Then I'll go to the focals, and they're still flat sound, but they'll just take your sound and just, I like that 8-inch woofer, and it just is closer to the kind of things that are in the world. So I start with the 5-inch, I go to the 8-inch, and then I have other 8-inch ones over there, events, and they're kind of old, but they just give me another reference. And then when I'm done my mix and I feel that everything's fine, then I'll take it out to the world, or while I'm doing it, and I'll as I mix down, okay, it sounds great in the studio. Then I'm going to go out to my car, and then I'm going to go to my headphones and this and that, etc. And by the time I get to mastering, it's really pretty straightforward and easy to do, because I got my mix. You get your mix as close to a mastered mix as you can. So look at the mastering tutorial, and hopefully this is helpful for you. It sounds like a lot, but you can just have one pair of monitors. That's totally fine. Then when you mix to that, like say you just have the Neumanns, and you mix to that and say they're 5-inch, and that's what you have, then go to your car stereo, go to everything else, and see, do it as you go. Don't wait to the end. Do it as you go. And you'll go, wow, I didn't realize that the bass was so loud and so boomy. And you come back and then you listen to, oh yeah, it is kind of boomy. And that's when you'll start getting the ear, if you don't already have it, the ear for a linear flat sound. And you'll know where to place it in that speaker, because now you have experience of, if I place it there, I pretty much know how it's going to sound out there. Okay. Hopefully this helps and gives you ideas. I really hope that folks listening will put comments in about your experience in mixing and even mastering, and definitely check out the mastering tutorial. And hopefully this, everybody just chimes in and, Gabriel, it's a good idea, but here's what I do, and I've tried this, and this really works well, and et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, when I'm mastering, I'm kind of freaky with monitors. Over here, I have a stereo, which is hooked up from my computer, from my DAW, and that stereo drives little tiny computer speakers, a little bit bigger computer speakers, some older, like 1970s AR speakers, Acoustic Research. They don't make them anymore, but they were one of the best speakers you could buy back in the late 60s, early 70s, and they have a really flat sound. So, and then and then the last one. I learned this from a mastering guy, a really good mastering guy, and then a boombox, a small boombox, not a big, ones, it's just a small regular boombox. It has a CD on the top that you put the CD in, and it's a boombox. Left, right, little speakers in the front, and then the input to that is coming from also here, so I can switch between your professional monitors to the little computer speakers. And the best one I love is just switching solely to the boombox and listening to what is the mix sound, and then when you do mastering, same thing. What does the mastering sound in that boombox? You'd be so surprised. And I did not make that up. When I went to a mastering house once, and I saw the big speakers, and they had the events, and that's why I bought the events back when. This is years and years ago, and there was a boombox there, and I'm like, okay, and it was explained as I just explained it, and it's amazing because you can, when you have big speakers and you push the volume, it sounds great all the time. The more, and that's the other thing, mix at a low volume, and then mix on a loud volume, but always make sure you're happy with a low volume. You tend not to want to do that. You want to hear, boom, but mix at a low volume because that's going to be your boombox kind of thing. And I was amazed of hearing that great stuff in the mastering room, and then all of a sudden, click, he went to the boombox, and I'm like, okay, wow, it sounds good in the boombox. Cool. I can hear the vocals. The cymbals aren't overwhelming me. I can hear the bass, even though the speakers are a little tiny. And a lot of times, if you can't hear your bass in tiny speakers, go back to your mix and just raise the high end a little bit on the bass. Because there's no bottom end in those kind of speakers. But if you want to hear the bass, put it up a little bit in the high end. Play with it. Okay, cool. I think we're good here. So please add comments, your thoughts, kind of speakers you use, techniques that you use in mixing, and if things that I haven't said. If you haven't, let's share. We're a community of songwriters, mixers, producers, recording artists. Let's just help each other out. I promote a community of everybody working together and passing ideas. And just all I ask is that you're civil in your comments, and let's help each other. So if you like this tutorial and you found it beneficial and you want to hear more stuff, I have other tutorials out there, but I'm always coming out with stuff. Please subscribe. That would be great. It helps me out, but it also helps you out getting more stuff. And as we go along, I'll be constantly putting more stuff out, and I have more stuff on my channel that's not music related. So if you're a budding novelist or poet, please look at those tutorials and my experiences with that, and then my type of reality show called Radical Cathedral. So check that out, and there's always new episodes coming. So if you would subscribe, that would be great. You get to get all this stuff coming out all the time, and please like if you liked it, and please definitely share it. I think sharing is the most important of all that. So please subscribe, please like if you like it, and please share. And I wish you to have a happy, great, beautiful, and wonderful mixing day, mastering day, but in general, just a wonderful day. Take care.